Welcome to the Hermetic Astrology Podcast. I'm Gary Caton in Waynesville, North Carolina. You can find me on the web at dreamastrologer.com. And today is Monday, August 26th. And we are now in the sign of Virgo, of course. I woke up the last couple of days and felt a chill returning to the morning air, so that there's this subtle shift from the dominant heat of Leo has begun to cool a little bit. So the solar god is giving way to the earth goddess, which is always nice. Leo is awesome, and I had a lot of fun, a lot of creative energy, but that heat. It's been sociologically shown that the summer heat is often associated with crime and stuff. People get irritable and whatnot. So it's nice to have a little bit of relief from the heat here as we move into the third part of the summer quarter, and the mutable sign of the summer quarter is Virgo. And 2 days ago, on Saturday, August 24th, we had a Venus-Mars conjunction in the early degrees of Virgo, right about in the 5th degree of Virgo. This is a pretty significant development. We only have Venus-Mars conjunctions about every couple years. And this is the third one in a row to happen in Virgo. So 2015, 2017, 2019 all happened in Virgo. And as I'm going to show you a little later, they're sandwiched in between two that happened in Leo. So there's 5 in a row that happen in either Leo or Virgo, the signs that we happen to be transitioning from and to at the moment. So this is a really interesting topic for discussion. You know, you'll hear a lot about the hieroskamos, the sacred marriage of the masculine and feminine with respect to Venus and Mars. And I think that's a really great way to look at it. But I'd like to share later on some practical ideas about what that looks like not just in mythology, but what that can actually look like in our lives and so forth. So what's going on is that this solar force of Leo, this extroverted solar force, right? This, because fire signs are, the alchemical element for fire is an upward pointing triangle, right? It's out and up and out. It's very extroverted. It's very dynamic. It's very in your face. You kind of can't miss it, right? Whereas with Virgo, it's an earth sign. Earth is symbolized by a downward pointing triangle, right? So the energy is about going down and in. And what's interesting is that the solar rulership by domicile or by sign, the sign of Leo is ruled by the sun, extends into the first decan of Virgo, as the sun is the ruler of the first 10 degrees of Virgo. I wrote an article recently for horoscope.com about the 3 decans of Virgo. I'm doing a whole series through all the signs for them. And so it's interesting how basically this extroverted solar energy that we may have been feeling as like coming from without and being imposed on us, now as it's coming into an earth sign, it's time to go inward and find that inner sun, you see. So it's an interesting dynamic right there. And along those lines, I wanted to share with you a review that I had recently of the podcast from, and it wasn't a listener review per se. Well, obviously they listened, but this was actually by a media person. There was an article on bustle.com by Alice Broster, Broster, called 7 Astrology Podcasts That Will Change Your View on Self-Care. So here's this idea we were talking about, self-care, finding that internal sun, going down and in earth, right? And I just thought that was really cool right away. Like, yeah, podcasting is about self-care. So, I mean, that's a wonderful, what in counseling, we call that a reframe, right? Um, a lot of times people will poo-poo, they say they call it navel gazing, right? Like it's some narcissistic, bad thing to like be interested in yourself and your self-development, but in fact, you can reframe it as this is self-care. This is taking care of the self. This is finding that internal sun, that internal source of creativity, right? Joni Mitchell said, very apropos, we are stardust. And indeed, we are. The carbon in our bodies was fused in a solar furnace many millions of years ago and strewn across the universe. So we are stars. And we can go within and find that creative source inside of ourselves. And that's what self-care is about. And I love it that she reframed podcasting in that way. This is about self-care. So she starts out with some podcasts for beginners, and then later on down the line, she gets to Hermetic Astrology podcast. And I just love what she says. She says, there's no question why Hermetic Astrology podcast has been listed as one of the best for the last decade. This is astrology for the pros. And I was like, dang, that's pretty awesome. Thank you, Alice, and Goddess bless you. It's always nice to hear, that after, gosh, I'm going on almost 12 years now, a Jupiter cycle of podcasting, that, this stuff is still resonating with people and that people get it and they get that it's another level, right? With that said, I do want to also say that I found that as a little bit of a wake-up call at the same time, because it's like, oh man, I can imagine somebody reading that and going, well, I'm just a beginner. That sounds a little intimidating. I might not be ready for that, yada yada. And I just want to say that I'm going to do the best I can to make sure that is not true, because in addition to teaching advanced stuff for many years now, I taught for many years the basic beginners class at the astrology college, and this was the very first class that people took before they even signed up for the main curriculum, just to see if they were interested, right? So I'm very capable of introducing people to basic beginner fundamentals as well, and I see this as something of a wake-up call. As don't forget to like start there, right? In counseling, there's an aphorism. They say start where the client is, right? Begin where the person is. Don't begin where you are and try. Hey, come over here. Oh, well, oh, you're here. Let me come to you and we'll begin there, and then we'll take a journey together, right? So I'm going to remember to do that, and as I do that, I want to talk about this idea of Virgo being an earth sign, right? And as I said, earth, the alchemical symbol for earth is a downward pointing triangle, okay? And so all of the cool stuff about earth is basically below the surface. And oftentimes with earth signs, you'll find that they are kind of quiet, maybe even a little bit shy. In terms of classical astrology or classical philosophy, and they have the temperaments, right? The temperament is known to be kind of reserved, and even they're even thought to be somewhat antisocial. And it's like, man, it's not about being antisocial. It's about being like actually wanting to make sure that they have their stuff together before they go putting it out there, right? But anyway, as you get to know earth people, you might start out in this kind of shy, unassuming. They'll often make great, very, very great team players, because they don't just put themselves out to the front, like a lot of people do before they're actually even ready to do that. They just charge out there. There's something to be said for that, but that's not the earth sign way. They'll hang around unassuming, and then you start to get to know them and you go, wow, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're doing the other. It's just like when you dig down into the earth, you find all these various crystals. On my altar over here, I've got, you know, many different kinds of crystals, all representative of the earth element, but many different specific uses and energies, right? So earth signs are often very multifaceted, very multi-talented. So if if you like what they're good at this, you can bet they're probably good at something else. And if you get to know them and ask them about things, you'll find out more and more of their gifts as you go along. And of course, Virgo is a mutable sign, as we mentioned earlier. It happens at the end of a season, and where the weather is transitioning from one way of being to another way of being. So as mutable signs, they are very adjustable, dynamic, and able to change things like according to what's happening, boots on the ground, right? So for instance, earth signs are about resources, for instance, right? So really just tangible, hands-on stuff, for instance, food, right? So let's just say we're farmers, and we got to decide what to plant this year. That act of deciding what to plant this year, that is a cardinal decision, right? That's like the CEO. Cardinal signs are like the CEOs of the zodiac. Say, we're going to plant beans, for instance, right? Remember that movie with James Dean, where he's, there's a war on, and he's trying to tell his father, hey, we got to plant some beans because everybody's going to want beans, and so forth, right? That kind of executive decision making, that's cardinal earth, that's Capricorn. And then when it comes time to, okay, we're going to plant beans. So what do beans need? How do you plant them? What helps them to grow, etc. All that stuff. That's Taurus. That's fixed earth. Actually making the plan of the Capricorn cardinal sign, putting it into action, getting all the resources together to make it happen and making it real, growing the beans. That's Taurus. And then later on, Virgo comes along. Virgo is the sign of the harvest. So it's like, hey, we got a bunch of beans. Now what do we do with them? We got to get them to market, right? So that's where the mutable, the ability to adjust, let's say, the normal distribution outlet, you usually put them on a train and send them to market. Oh, there's a problem with the train. We got to find some trucks, or we got to find something else. That was another part of that story. I can't even remember the name of the movie, right? And I think it was like Giant. I can't remember if I got the name right, but there was this idea that James Dean's father had about how to get the lettuce to market, right? By putting it on trains with ice. And so keep it fresh and so on, right? That's a mutable sign trait, that they can adjust the thinking and try different things till they find something that works. Virgo is earth. It's about resources. It's about practical planning, inner development, finding all those things that we're good at, developing ourselves into a multifaceted personality. And it's also about mutable. It's about being able to adjust and flow and just work with what you got, that's because, things that you find, for instance, I'm a trained counselor. There's my degree in the background there from Old Dominion. And you learn all this stuff in the textbooks, right, when you're in school about this, that, and the other. And then you get out in real life and you find the conditions on the ground, and you've got to adjust all that theory that you learned into what they call the book knowledge into the practical everyday aspects of actually making it happen, right? So that's mutable. The fixed is like the theory, and all that, or the cardinal. And then, actually making it happen is more like the mutable. On that note, I wanted to share something else that I think is really interesting. And I'm very eclectic, right? So while I definitely am well versed and and respect what I call the classical model of astrology. A lot of people call it traditional. That is the Hellenistic and medieval parts of it. But for me, traditional is back in the beginning, the visual, and then the classical is like the middle period, and then we have the modern, psychological, and so forth. I pull from all of them. I don't limit myself into one of those three boxes. So I'm very eclectic in that way. And right here, I'm pulling from actually the Vedic tradition, the modern psychological tradition, and this classical idea of the elements and putting them all together, which I find exciting. And some people, you know, oh, they might have issue with that, but, you know, to each their own, right? So this model is, a lot of people know it as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it's also a theory of motivation. What motivates people to achieve what he called self-actualization? How do people become fully themselves, right? Because you look around and you see certain people, like Gandhi, for instance, is one, that Martin Luther King is another, that people will say, man, that dude, he left it all on the field, they would say, if they were sports figures, right? They got it all. They got everything that was in them out and fully developed. How do they do that? And Maslow started looking at this idea, how do people, and he came up with this idea that there's certain basic needs that human beings have. First of all, you know, if you think about it, you know, you got physiological needs. You need air to breathe, right? You need water to drink, and you need food to eat, and then you need shelter, right? So these are just basic physiological needs that any human being has to meet. And basically, you know, if you don't got a place to stay, it's going to make it pretty hard to make friends and have relationships and so forth, right? So your intimacy needs or relationship needs come after your basic resource needs. And then you go, and then once you meet those, you can go up to the next level and so on, right? So I had this idea of combining these with the idea of the four elements, and this idea that comes from Vedic astrology, but really it comes from like Hindu philosophy and so forth, that there's four main goals of life, right? So you have artha, which is prosperity, right? To achieve prosperity. That's a legitimate aim in life, right? Because through prosperity, you can take care of your family, you can take care of your community, etc. Legitimate aim in life. Then they have moksha, which is about liberation, but really in terms of like Buddhist philosophy, liberation is understanding that you know, basically, you know, I'm trying to think of the dude's name, the head priest of the Buddhists. What are they called? The Dalai Lama, right? He says, my religion is kindness. It's that simple. Like, kindness is basically so when you're liberated from this, you know, these attachments that everybody's, you know, trying to run around, oh, I, me, mine, right? George Harrison wrote that song, I, me, mine, I, me, mine, I, me, mine, right? When you start getting attached to this idea of developing resources, I, me, mine, I'm going to get mine and the heck with everybody else, then kindness kind of goes by the wayside. But liberation is actually understanding that there is absolutely every situation, even when you're dealing with enemies, even when you're dealing with people who are persecuting you, even when you're dealing with the worst injustice, kindness is always the right way, always the best way. And I think that's really interesting in terms of you know, this idea of developing our relationship needs, you know, because basically relationships are built on our capacity to maintain kindness with other human beings, right? And then We have kama, which I'm calling aspiration, but it's the desire for pleasure and beauty. So whether that be intellectual pleasure or physical pleasure. Um, and then dharma, purpose, right? Truth, cosmic order. And so, and this is what's really interesting is that in the beginning, Maslow thought that self-actualization was the highest purpose, becoming all you are, right? That's a pretty high purpose. Very few people actually manage to do all of that. But he said, no, 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 there's one more step after that, helping others to self-actualize, right? Helping others to become all they can be. That's even higher, transcendent of self-actualization. Helping other people to self-actualize was the highest thing on his pyramid. So anyway, if we come back to this idea of Virgo as an earth sign, we're talking about artha, prosperity. Okay, so taking care of physical resource needs and making sure, and how do we do that best, right? Do we go solar? Do we get a tiny house, right? Because that's the kindest, softest way to live on the planet, for instance, etc., right? So these are not all separate. All of these things, right, our dharma, the truth or the cosmic order of things should inform how we achieve artha. Because if we're just going about greedy, way of achieving artha, when our purpose has flown the coop, we're never going to make it out of that pit that we've dug for ourselves by being a selfish, greedy SOB, right? We're not going to find that inner sun. We're not going to find that will elevate. So it's important to understand that these things, none of them exist in isolation, but that primarily we're talking about artha, we're talking about prosperity, and specifically we're talking about mutable earth, which again is how do we distribute the fruits of what we've already grown? How do we get it out there? How do we get it to market? How do we take what we already do well and sell it? Marketing, all this stuff, right? This is all has to do with Virgo, right? Virgo is ruled by Mercury, god of commerce, right? So that's important to remember. All right, so all right, so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this idea. So as I said, a lot of people have talked about this Venus-Mars conjunction being about the sacred marriage. And I want to talk a little bit about what does that mean? What does that even look like? Sacred marriage, heteros gamos, and we can talk about it being, the marriage of the masculine and feminine inside of us, right? All of us, regardless of our gender or our gender identity or how we identify, we have both genders and all gender possibilities within us. And as we develop both sides, that is the sort of active and the passive, right? If you think about it in terms of, for instance, the I Ching, the first two diagrams, I've seen them translated as force and field, right? Masculine, active principle, force, field, feminine, passive, receptive principle, field, right? There's a wonderful movie with Will Smith where he plays this caddy that is called Bagger Vance. It's, the legend of Bagger Vance, and then there's this one scene where he's trying to explain to his pro that he's essentially coaching, hey, you're just going about this from force, right? And that's only going to take you so far. You can whack at that ball is all you want, and you're never going to get it to achieve some kind of art form until you also integrate the field, right? He was talking about see the field, connect with the flowing of the tides and the feeling of the earth, you know, underneath you, and the birds flying overhead. And when you become one with all of that, and then you apply your force within the context of the field, now that's magic, right? Um, so really, that's what we're talking about, is the marriage of these active and passive principles. Um, and this, you know, might sound, you know, new agey or woo woo, right? But I'm telling you, it's been there the whole time. It's been there. It's embedded even in Hellenistic astrology, right? Because I had the great good fortune to just by accident, happenstance, which is a key word for something we're going to talk about here in a minute, which is known as the lot of fortune. Well, really, all the lots, fate. Fate is probably not the right word, but happenstance, just by luck. I happened to find myself in Berkeley Springs. I was hitchhiking along. Here I am in Berkeley Springs, and the lady who let me stay in her cabin in exchange for fixing it up and doing chopping wood and this and that says, "Hey, you're into astrology, right?" She knew me from the New Age Church in Winchester. And she said, "Let me take you down here and meet these folks." It was Robert Schmidt and Project Hindsight, right? And Schmidt taught us that, you know, all about these various ways of, or various characters in the chart through this thing that he called the nautical metaphor, right? So, for instance, you have on the active masculine side of things, or the force, right? You have this character called the oikodespotes, right? Which, I mean, there's the word despots in there. I'm a little bit like, oh, who's this? What's this? What's this dude all about? Right? The oikodespotes is literally means the master of the house, or the, but it's what it is. It's the domicile lord of your predominator, which your predominator is usually the sun or the moon. If it's a day chart, it's the sun. If it's a night chart, it's the moon. If both of them are cadent, you actually have to go to the ascendant, I think, if that's right. Yeah. If both of them are cadent, you go to the ascendant for the predominator. But this oikodespotes is like the captain of the ship. So the captain sets the agenda, right? Remember how we were talking about cardinal signs? It's similar to that idea. So this is about setting an agenda. It's about managing things, right? It's about saying, okay, we're going to go here and we're going to take this particular route to get there, right? And then you have this cat called the Curios, whose job is to actually make that happen. The captain sets the agenda, and then the Curios says, okay, now I'm going to make that, I'm going to bring the ship to the destination that the captain has set. The captain was seen as like the owner of the ship, who says, you know, I want to ship, you know, beans to this place because they need them, whatever. And then you have the first officer, who was called the helmsman, or the helms person, I guess, who is the lord of the ascendant. And the helmsman steers the ship according to what the Curios tells them about the oikodespotes agenda, right? So these three cats are all like actively steering the ship, you know, setting an agenda, making a plan to make that agenda happen, and then steering the ship to make sure it gets there, right? So this is all force. Now, then there's this other dude who is the second officer, and this is the Lord of Fortune. So fortune is simply what's simply called fortune, or the part of fortune. A lot of people hear it as the part of fortune. Back then, they knew it as the lot of fortune, which is different between night and day charts. But basically, you take the sun-moon angle and you rotate the chart as if the moon were on the ascendant, and then you rotate the chart with the sun on the ascendant, and you get, that's how you get fortune and spirit, a lot of spirit. So the Lord of Fortune, or the domicile ruler of fortune, is the second officer, and he sits up on the prow of the ship. and he's kind of this lookout. He's looking for what befalls the ship, having nothing to do with the force, with their own actions, but just, what's out there. So there's this sort of, this is the field, right? So for instance, like, now there's a certain amount of that we can know about this. For instance, with the Titanic, right? They were sailing the Northern Passage. They knew there was going to be icebergs, right? Just don't know when or where or how big. And so you got to be on the lookout for those bad boys. Sometimes you know what to look for. Sometimes you don't even know what to look for, and stuff happens you couldn't have possibly imagined. This is the field. This is where your active force meets up with everything else that is. They come together, right? So there's this cat that's sitting up there trying to say, hey, I know y'all are trying to make this happen, and you picked a route according to whatnot, but you might want to steer over that way because I see this going on over here and whatnot, right? And this is related to fortune, which is about happenstance. It's about just what happens, what befalls the native. So you can see right away, if you know what you're looking at, there, right there, you have sacred marriage. Because I'll tell you why. Because they thought it was a really good idea, for instance, if the second officer on the prow was able to communicate with either the oikodespotes, the kurios, or the first officer, right? The oikodespotes, again, is the domicile lord of the predominator. The kurios is an interesting, it's basically, you have to figure out who is the most fit out of several different officers. So you have a whole list of, like, the planet that is the bound ruler of the ascendant is one of them, the ruler of the moon, the ruler of fortune, the bound lord of the prenatal lunation or syzygy, the domicile lord of the ascendant, domicile lord of the midheaven, and any planets that were in phasis or making an appearance. Out of these 7, you would decide, okay, which one of those has got the most dignity, and then you would say, okay, they get elected as the first officer. And then the helmsman or helmsperson is the ruler of the first, domicile ruler of the first house. But anyways, the idea is, if you've got some, like, if the second officer, whose job is to look out for what happens with no what happens as no result of anything we did, just happens. If it has some relationship to those other 3, then there's successful communication about what's going on versus what we're trying to do, and everything can work out, right? So that's the sacred marriage. It's right there. It was there the whole time. It's not this modern woo-woo thing. And in fact, you can find it in other ways, indeed, because if you really understand ancient astrology, you'll know that there's 3 charts that you need to understand for any given person, minimum 3 if you ask me. And that is the normal chart that we call the the horoscope, horoscopos meaning hour marker. That is the ascendant, right? The place where the ascendant is the place where the ecliptic crosses the horizon in the east. It's where the cosmic principles of the heavens intersect with the earthly principles, right? So there's this, and things, what happens with that is, depending on where you're born, right? You know how certain houses can be really big and other houses can be small. There's distortions that happen when the cosmic order is beautiful and whole and symmetrical and all that. But when it meets up with the earthly, there's this distortion. There's this, and that's where the idea of the shadow comes from. For instance, there's this distortion that happens. So really, the ascendant chart is about this intersection of this pure, relatively pure cosmic soul intention, right? Even Plato thought that our souls come from the stars, for instance, right? That's not New Age or woo woo at all. I mean, it may be woo, but it's not new woo. We come from the stars. We are stars, in fact. But there's this sort of relatively pure or holistic soul intention that it was viewed from a cosmic level, and it intersects with the earth plane, and whoops, like it's a little bit off kilter, right? Just because. So that's the ascendant chart. Now, then you can also take fortune and you can put it in the first house, and you can look at the chart, the fortune chart. So you would look, for instance, is the ruler of fortune in a sign that can cast an angle or a ray, a whole sign aspect back to fortune? Then then you've got that sacred marriage going on, right? You can communicate. There's is the moon or are other planets in the angles from fortune? This was thought to be a great indicator of eminence, for instance. So you may not have anything in the 10th house, but you got a whole bunch of stuff in the 10th house from fortune. You might still be famous. You see what I'm saying? And you can do the same thing with the spirit chart. You put the lot of spirit in the first house, and you look at, is the ruler communicating back to spirit? Are there planets in the angles, and so forth? And I have used this to great effect, for instance, when people are talking to me about changing careers. Very common question you get as an astrologer goes something like this. I got this thing I've been doing. I'm really good at it. It pays the bills, but I'm not feeling it anymore so much. And there's this other thing that I'm really passionate about, and I want it so bad, but I'm not sure if I can make a living at it. And what do you think? Tell me, should I quit my day job and just go for it, or should I go part-time and kind of, ease my way into it, so forth. This technique is great for addressing that, because you can look at the fortune chart and you can say, okay, fortune chart basically represents like, the field. What just happens if you just go about what you do naturally, right? What befalls you if you just go along, just being you? What happens, right? That's kind of the fortune chart. And then the spirit chart represents more of a conscious development. It's more like, the force. It's like, what happens when I, forcefully apply myself? And so if you see that the spirit chart is set up where, yeah, the ruler's communicating back to spirit, you got stuff in the angles, for instance, yeah, it looks like you can go for it. Like, if one of those things is not happening, yeah, maybe you really should take the part-time gig and keep the day job until you work your way into being able to navigate that chart a little better, for instance, right? So you can see, and Schmidt talked about these. So you've got really three charts, and then you have like three different levels on which any of the planetary significations can manifest, right? So there's the cosmic level, which would be essentially essential dignity, right? So if a planet is in one of its own signs, or its exaltation or triplicity or bounds or face, deacon, this is seen as just a natural ability to do its thing, to get to achieve the significations that it's here to do. Then you can have accidental dignity, where that cosmic order may not be there, but when that cosmic order meets up with the earth, oh, it happens to in a way where, oh yeah, that one's in the 10th house. Well, actually, even though it doesn't have any cosmic way of naturally meeting that, turns out when it intersects with the earth, yeah, boom, there you go. And barring either one of those two, you can still get the significations of the planet through the lot. It could just happen. It could just like lucky, or hmm, maybe you might call it fated. Not sure if that's the right word because it's a very loaded word, but in other words, it may be that it's just meant to be. Like, even though this person doesn't necessarily appear to have any natural ability or any sort of hope on the sociological level, which would be more like the houses, they are just meant to do this thing. Like, forces just fall into place, and there they are, you know. And that sometimes that's really powerful. You know, you can't discount that. That is a it's a fact of life, right? Um, and you know, the sad truth is that no matter what your level of apparent, you know, privilege, um, I myself am straight, white, and male. So, you know, and I live in the USA. So, according to, you know, most accounts of the lottery, you know, man, I hit the lottery on that one, right? But I also have a history of growing up in poverty and with, you know, genetic disposition towards mental illness, or what's called mental illness, anyways. So, those factors kind of, but even, you know, even without those two, let's just say I was straight, white, and male, and like seemingly very privileged within, you know, the current situation. Really, it's only about 1% or 10% at most of the population that is truly privileged in the sense of able to do all this stuff of, you know, setting the agenda, steering the ship, etc., in terms of like you know, the the wealth inequality is so, there's such a disparity now that it's really only the very top level people who have that true um, level of privilege where they're able to, and the rest of us are kind of, you know, left to, you know, scrap for it, basically. And there's a really interesting story in mythology about this that I think applies, and you know, it comes from Egyptian. You know, the Ra, the sun god, was the firstborn of Jeb and Nut, and you know, that basically he was like this enfant terrible. You know, he was despotic. He was like, hey, you know, I pretty much got everything. I don't want to share it with nobody else. You know, like, and he forbade Nut to give birth in any day of the year. He's like, man, I rule this whole thing. And the Egyptian year was 360 days. It was a perfect circle, right? It was that. Now we know that the year isn't exactly 360 days. It's actually 365 and what, a quarter. And so the way this myth sort of accounts for that, they say that you know, because Nut was pregnant. She needed to give birth, but she couldn't because there was this despotic, you know, sort of, you know, privileged person at the very top of things who didn't want anybody else to have any of the stuff, you know. And so Thoth comes along. Thoth is later equated with the Greek Hermes. They are very similar, although Thoth did have differences as well. But Thoth comes along and he says to the moon god, who is male in that, I believe, certainly was male in the Mesopotamian, and says, "Hey, I tell you what, I'll gamble you for you know, for some of the solar light, right? You've got these 360 days. Let's wager. Let's play a game. We'll throw some dice." And he won. He bested the moon god at this game of dice and won 1/72 of the solar light, which turns out to be about 5 days, right? So through happenstance, through the rolls of the dice, and or some magic, right? Because he may have been able to like magically, you know, he had the power of the word, right? In some cosmologies, Thoth brought the world into being through the uttering of a single word. That sounds familiar. right? But anyway, we won't go down that tangent. But then Nut gives birth to the rest of the pantheon, you know, Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. So there's this. So just from this 1/72nd that he was able to get through magic, gambling, happenstance, this whole other, like, it's only 5 days, but man, it changes everything, right? So you see, this is why people say, for instance, in hard times, that folks turn to magic and astrology and whatnot. This is why. Because guess what? Dude can sit up there and say, I own it all. You can't have anything on any day of the year. And you got, if you're good with them dice, baby, you can say, oh yeah, guess what? Now you got to deal with a different world, baby. So, you know, that's I think a message of hope in there, and that we can see applies to, because, you know, Trump ain't the only narcissist, y'all. I mean, Bezos and Zuckerberg and all these cats, they're basically robber barons 2.0, right? We've been through this and we beat those suckers and we'll beat them again, you know. But you got to be clever. You got to roll those dice, and you got to have magic. You got to be able to use the tools that you've got available to you. Right? Because you're not going to beat these cats with science. You're not going to beat them at their own game. You got to be able to do that sacred marriage. You got to be able to look within you and find that sort of magical part of yourself that these cats aren't aligned with, and find a way to change the game and beat them that way. This reminds me of something that my publisher, Aaron Cheek, introduced me to. You talk about happenstance. I mean, I just wound up with this dude as a publisher through nothing that I did necessarily. And he happens to be really into this philosopher, Gebser, a French philosopher who, and it's interesting because, you know, as I was telling the story of Ra, who wanted to control everything and keep anything else from being, it reminded me very much of Gebser's philosophy of the sort of consciousness of humanity and how it has moved through different structures. And right now we're in this structure of consciousness that he calls the mental structure. And the mental structure is very much like Ra. No, 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 none of these other ones, that you can't have nothing, no day of the year, all 360 days, mine. I, me, mine, right? And it's very, you know, and it's, so there's this one way to do things. There's, you know, that's my way or the highway, blah, 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 right? Sounds familiar. But what Gebser said is, like, the only way that human consciousness can get to the next level is actually to integrate, and these are my words, the way he said it is, you can find it out there, you know, the main book that he did was called The Ever-Present Origin. But, you know, my understanding of it is, like, basically we have to integrate these disowned, and I'm putting these in very Jungian terms, right, Carl Jung. We have to integrate these disowned parts, right? This mental structure says, no, 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 all of you other ways of being, like, go away. I'm the right one. I rule all 360 days of the year. But actually, Gebser says, nah, man, we got to get back to that primordial consciousness. We got to get back to that mythic consciousness. And when we're able to integrate and see reality through all of them simultaneously, that's the next integral structure. It's fully integrated, right? And so with that in mind, I'm going to share another myth, because the mythic structure being integrated with that's essentially the sacred marriage. You see, what Gebser was talking about is integrating these mythic structures in with the rational. So as far as I can tell, one of the one really obvious sacred marriage myth that I think a lot of people don't necessarily see it as such is the myth that is often associated with the sign of Aries. Jason and the golden fleece, right? The golden fleece is a symbol basically for our higher selves, you know, or, you know, if you were going to put it in Freudian terms, the superego, the ideal self, or whatnot. Um, and then it's hung in a grove, and it's protected by this dragon that never sleeps. Well, that's Draco. That's so obvious because Draco is a polar star that never sets, polar constellation, right? So that's Draco. But what does Draco represent? Generally, dragons like hoard treasure and stuff, right? It's that arta consciousness, right? That resource consciousness gone wrong without dharma. It's arta without dharma. You see, it's arta without purpose. It's like I me mine, you know, and it doesn't have a higher purpose, um, or in the negative sense. That's what the dragon represents, right? And then there's these fire-breathing bulls with brass hooves that guard the tree as well, right? And that's sort of the middle realm. That's sort of what you know, Freudian and Jungians would call the ego. The ego's job is to mediate between the dragon, the id, and the superego, the idealistic self. And then the ego's job is to mediate. So bulls are sort of half wild, half tamed, right? So there's this sort of middle ground. So you can see this idea of three levels of being, um, maybe even the three charts that we were talking about before. You know, and this idea of a tree with a snake is not, again, heard that story before, right? But now what's really fascinating to me is, like, how does Jason actually get the fleece? Medea. He cannot do it just through force. He needs the feminine sorceress, Medea, right? Um, And it's really interesting to break this story down because Jason was the great grandson of Hermes, and he was the rightful heir to the throne. His father should have been king, but there was this power hungry usurper, right? This shadow figure, Peleus, who sort of stole the throne from his father, and Jason wanted to get the throne back. And in order to get the throne back, Peleus says, "Yeah, sure, go get the golden fleece, and I'll give you the throne," right? Um, and Jason says, "All right, I can do that." And he goes on this great journey, but ultimately, the only way he ever actually manages that is through the help of Medea. Now, Medea is the granddaughter of Helios, the sun god, and she's also a priestess of Hecate, who is like, you know, this goddess of witchcraft and sorcery, essentially, right? Magic. Um, she falls in love with Jason, and she agrees to help him with one condition, that he will marry her and take her with him. So here's the sacred marriage. She says, "This is sacred, yo. This is not, I'm not fooling around. This is a sacred marriage." Um, and then basically she helps him defeat the bull and the dragon, and Jason gets the fleece, becomes king. And then what happens? Well, Jason says, "Oh, now that I'm king, you know, that promise and everything, yeah, I'll take you with me, but I'm kind of going to put you to the side over here, and, you know, I'll have some other stuff going on." And he basically makes a political marriage, for political gain. And Medea says, you know, you promised me and only me. And she basically kills the I don't know what you want to call her, the other woman, um, and the children, which is, you know, that's pretty. But I mean, you got to understand that in the context of back in that day, once she became, you know, what's the word, you know, once she resorted to treachery, then, you know, her children were probably going to be enslaved. So, you know, her killing the children was, in her mind, maybe an act of mercy. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just trying to put it in terms of like the way things were and whatnot. But um, basically, you know, Jason doesn't stay true to his promise, and the sacred marriage falls apart. Um, and I mean, I can really see that in terms of like the way the world has developed, because guess what? Newton, Galileo, all these cats who like the scientific community likes to trot out as their heroes, they were alchemists, astrologers, magicians, all of them. And there's no way you can convince me that Newton would have found the secrets of the Principia without that other stuff. You have to have both to be whole, right? But then they want to say they get the magic, and they develop, and they get the kingdom, right? They get their, and then they say, yeah, Medea, you know, buzz off, like we don't need you anymore, right? So they want to disown the magic, and they want to disown the alchemy and say, nah, that, you know, that, they want to minimize it and everything. But it's like, nah, man, you don't. And what happens? It, you know, science becomes this thing that has become, you know, it's killing the world, right? Plastics and all this crap that is a product of science, but it's a product of an unbalanced science that is unintegrated with its own. It's not part of a sacred marriage anymore, you see? So I find this story to be really, really powerful example of the sacred marriage, what it is and what it isn't, and the consequences of not uh, remaining true to it. Okay, now I'm going to try to bring all this back to the current astrology, so bear with me here. I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to look at the most recent conjunction of the Sun and Venus. Because, yeah, we're talking about Venus and Mars coming together, but they're each on their own journey, and we've got to understand each one of them, just like we've got to understand who Medea is and who Jason are to understand what they become as a marriage. We've got to understand Venus and Mars in the same way. So here's the chart of the previous Sun-Venus cazimi. Now, this isn't the chart for the exact moment of the cazimi. This is a chart that I worked up for my followers, for my members. It's the hour of Venus. Venus rules the hour just before dawn on Wednesdays. So it's the hour of Venus. Venus is on an angle, and Venus is in the heart of the Sun. So this is kind of a magical moment where you can actually call on Venus to maybe set the stage for the next 9 months of as she is in her evening star appearance, right? But you'll notice here that Venus is joining with the Sun in the sign of Leo. So here we have this feminine planet with this solar infusion. So Medea was the granddaughter of Helios, right? So sounds familiar, right? So we have what might be called the solar feminine, essentially, right? Medea, and this is interesting because, you know, a lot of people think the solar feminine is a new thing. Medea was the solar feminine, yo. I mean, it's pretty obvious. I mean, in the end, she kind of flies off in a chariot of dragons, you know, given to her by Helios, you know. So this is a woman who does what she wants, you know, and she's willing to help Jason, but if he doesn't abide by his word, by his agreements, then, you know, that's another story. So we have this solarized Venus. Now, because Venus is faster than Mars, as she meets with Mars, we have this concept called pushing, where the faster planet pushes their significations, their agenda onto the slower planet. So Venus is now currently pushing her significations, these solar feminine So Venus is telling Mars, who's in Virgo, right? Virgo is the feminine earth sign. So Mars might actually be coming more from a place of what we might call the lunar masculine. And Venus is pushing this solar feminine agenda on him. And he has yet actually to make, I'm saying he and she and all this, and forgive me if that's a problem for you, but it's hard to avoid. They, let's see if I can refer to Mars as they are in the sign of Virgo, yet to quite achieve the Cazimi with the sun. Now, I did the same thing. And by the way, if you want to get these charts, I'm all the time sending these magical electional charts out to my followers, out to my members, subscribers, whatever you want to call them. If you want access to these things, you can look at the special offers page on my website, and there's three levels to join. And there's a private Facebook group and all that. I tried to do the same thing, find a Mars hour with Mars on an angle, but yeah, the moon was like applying to a square to Saturn when I did that, and I was like, I don't know. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. So the best I could do is I got Mars in a succedent house, which means that it's the next one to be on an angle. And it's a really fortunate house. It's the 11th house. Mars rules the ascendant. So it's a Mars hour, Mars conjunct the sun, Mars in the 11th. Still pretty good. This is a time where you can appeal to Mars to set the agenda for the next 2 years. Really 27 months is the synodic cycle of Mars. So Mars won't achieve union with the sun until September 2nd, which is Labor Day. So right now you have this sort of solar feminine pushing her significations onto this some maybe lunar masculine figure, and somehow each one of them has to find a way to achieve this sacred marriage. And what's interesting about that is they're really going opposite directions, because pretty soon, as the sun moves past Mars, Mars is going to begin to rise in the morning sky. Venus is faster than the sun, so she's jetting out and heading off into the evening sky. So there's this meeting of there's this very complex meeting, and it's made even more complex by the fact that, well, it's happening in the underworld, in invisibility. It's happening as an invisible. So even though this is the third, and I'll just briefly show you the report that I made for my members as well. I have some visuals that will go along with that. It's important to understand that visually you cannot see this. There's some Sabian symbols that go along with this too that I go into that are really fascinating, but I don't know if we have time to go into them right here. That's another thing that I do. Like I said, I don't put myself in a box and say, oh, that's not classical, so I don't do it. I'll do whatever works. But yeah, if you look at these three conjunctions that happen in Virgo, right? There was one on November 2nd, 2015. There was one on October 5th, 2017. And there's this one that just happened on August 24th. They're very different in terms of their ability to be seen in the sky. The first one happened with Venus at near her maximum elongation. So they're in the morning sky. They're about halfway up to the midheaven, right there in the middle of the 11th house, essentially, and high and bright, easily seen. And to me, visibility basically is like agency. They have the ability to be seen. Then as people see them, they're able to have agency through that seeing, And then the next one happened with Venus and Mars a little bit lower in the sky, still visible. Now this one's happening in the underworld. So it's like, oh, you can do it when in broad daylight, when everything's easy to see. Well, can you do it when it's a little harder to see? And can you do it when it's completely dark? It's like there's three levels of this refinement, Virgo. of the sacred marriage process that we're being invited to achieve. So this is a very difficult, this is an advanced operation, right? So like in alchemy, for instance, you start out working with the plant operations, right? So you can make, for instance, I have some spagyric tinctures over here on my altar. And then later, when you begin to work with the metals, that's a more advanced operation. And so we're talking about, yeah, an advanced operation here. Can you do it in the dark? Can you do it when you've got a blindfold on you? Can you do it with one hand behind your back? I don't know, whatever metaphor you want to make. That's what's going on here, right? So this is, and then, as I said, these two are going to basically head off into different directions. So there's this seed that's being planted right now in the dark. And then the analogy for this is, you may not actually be conscious of the sacred marriage happening, and it could still be happening, right? It could be happening in a way that you can't see, right? You're not necessarily conscious of it, but it's happening, especially if you are conscious of trying to make space for it to happen. And if you're consciously making space for it to happen, but you're not sure if it's happening, it probably is. You just can't see it yet. And when these two, as Mars becomes visible as morning star, Venus becomes visible as evening star, as they become visible and go on their separate journeys, you can begin to see how these two operations, force and field, have become infused with a new energy. And you can begin to pick and choose, okay, is this time to apply force? Is this the time to be on the lookout for stuff that's coming I didn't do anything to, and there can be a conversation between the two, right? Because for instance, I have noticed over the last couple of years, as I've started to work more as a mage, as a magician, doing magical work, doing talismans, etc., when I set my intention, okay, I want to do, for instance, last summer, I was working on a Jupiter talisman for a client. She had a really strong Jupiter in her chart, and she wanted to sell her house. And I've had great luck using the fixed stars and the magic stuff associated with them, helping people sell their homes. I've done it for myself, and I've helped other people do it too. As I was working on this stuff, I went out to do my photography. So there's force, right? I was doing my work for my client, and then I go out into the field, literally into the field, to take photographs. And I thought I was going to see Mars before I could get, and I had to go like to the east before I could get to this place where I thought this blank of clouds comes up, and I was like, uh-oh, because these summer thunderstorms can be pretty intense. And I was like, maybe I just ought to hang out here for a second and be that cat on the helm of the ship, seeing what's coming, right? And as I'm doing that, I'm like, I don't think I'm really supposed to go where I thought I was going. I'm supposed to hang out here, because you had Jupiter really high and bright in the sky, and then you had this bank of clouds that were still relatively far off. They were coming this way. I could have just drove through them. I could have just forced my way through them. But actually, it was pretty cool to sit there and watch the thunder, in the clouds, and I got some awesome photographs of that. And I realized afterwards, you know what? Like, that's pretty much a confirmation from Jupiter. Like, yeah, I'm happy you're doing my magic, and yeah, maybe you should do a little bit more. And I ended up taking that stuff that I had been working with, which was basically Jupiter on the fixed star Alphecca, and I worked it into my presentation at Great Lakes Astrology Conference. We made talismans right there live at an astrology conference, which I thought was pretty cool. And I'm waiting for word. We might be able to do that again next year. So I'm waiting on confirmation for that. But yeah, the point is that you can have a conversation between these two aspects of force and field. You can set your intention to do something, and as you're doing it, be aware that, you know, the powers that be, or the what they call the anima mundi, the soul of the world, may be in agreement with that or may not. I may have gotten a very different message of, no, 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 you ain't supposed to be messing with this right now, son. You need to put that down and get back to work on something else, right? And I could choose to listen to that or force my way through, and, you know, we'll see how that works out. Um, but yeah, that to me, that's what the sacred marriage is all about. It's about managing that conversation between force and field within ourselves, within our lives, and listening to and honoring both parts. And right now, going within and finding that inner solar seed, and beginning to develop it through both ways, right? Through both. Eventually, Mars is going to be morning star and Venus is going to be evening star. We're going to develop both sides of that solar seed that's being sown, that's being sort of, we are essentially being like penetrated by that at the moment. And as we go in and find that seed within ourselves and nurture that seed and make space for it to grow in our lives, then we're going to see that growth come through the next, you know, this new moon. I talked about this in my astrology.com article about the magical transits of the summer. This new moon that's coming up, man, it is powerful. And what's crazy about it is, you know, I did like, I did so much research into the Venus Mars cycle. I have a whole, like, you know, basically a small book that I wrote about the historical ramifications of the Venus Mars cycle. And one of the things that I found in doing the research on that is Michelle Finey in Australia. She did a really good book, and she talks about, she basically organized the Venus-Mars conjunctions into what she calls Saros series, which means that every 32 years you get you know, a conjunction near the same degrees. But it's not just that, because basically, and that means every 25 Venus-Mars conjunctions, which is about 32 years, you get, so if you go back to August 24th, 1987, you had a conjunction in the early degrees of Virgo, but it was also conjunct the sun. So what's interesting is that basically every 5 conjunctions, you get one of these Venus-Mars conjunctions that's also conjunct the sun. It's in the underworld. It's this invisible sacred marriage that's really hard, advanced operation, but has, of course, the harder the work, the greater the rewards. That's the Saturn principle at work right there. So every 5 conjunctions, which is 6.5 to 7 years, you get one of these solar conjunctions with Venus-Mars. And then every 25, which is about 32 years, you get one in the same area of the zodiac. So, and I looked, and it's not just that. This August 24th, 1987, it was the same thing that's going on now, where you didn't just have Sun, Venus, and Mars, but you also had a new moon, and you had Mercury, right? So you had Sun, Moon, Venus, Mars, Mercury, 5 planets all in the early Virgo. You had the same thing going on back then. And that was really fascinating for me, because that's about when I first embarked on the spiritual path, which is really fascinating because, you know, I'm a night birth and my moon is in Virgo. So my predominator, some people call it the sect light of my chart, is in Virgo. And it had this solarized sacred marriage happening. And what happened was, I thought I was going to school to be an architect, and I started having these crazy dreams with animals talking to me. We were exploring caves and stuff, and I realized, you know what? I don't want to be on that journey where, you know, Jason gives Medea the boot. I don't want to be part of that whole trip where, yeah, Medea's disowned. I wanted to find Medea. I wanted to find the magic. And so, you know, I left academia before the next Venus-Mars conjunction in 1989. I left academia behind, and I was on a whole nother journey. So it's been 32 years. It's like, oh my God, it's hard to believe. But yeah, so I'm really looking forward to it. It's like, wow, like what in the world is in store for me with this new, solarized Venus Mars sacred marriage happening in Virgo? I mean, I can't even imagine. Um, but I can tell you that if you tune into it and you really let it in and you make room for it, and you that the possibilities are beyond imagination. I can tell you that for sure because I've lived it for the last 32 years. That was quite the little odyssey we took there. Really went down the rabbit hole, but I'm going to bring it back to the beginning and the basics and just bid you um, good fortune with your Artha, prosperity, um, doing your business in the age of digital stuff is a whole nother trip, and it's a constantly moving target. I need to work on my own website and my own commerce applications and whatnot and revamp those and whatnot. So I'm on the same trip right here with you, even after, 32 years of doing this stuff. And so I bid you good luck with the Artha trip, and bright blessings of Mars, soon to become morning star, and Venus, soon to become evening star, and the sacred marriage that is happening inside you. And may you find your internal sun. All right. Until next time, bright blessings.